What's a mook?
A mook? What's a mook?
You can't call me a mook.
I can't?
No.
I give you mook. Hey, it's a mook.
We're back with a whole new episode of Movies with the Mooks. I'm Oliver Drawson.
Brand new episode with Oliver Drawson and Kevin Rosmer here. Movies with the Mooks. We are the Mooks. And, you probably are wondering what a mook is. Well, it's... I think the dictionary defined it as a fool. Some kind of a foolish person.
I mean, if you want to go with the old outdated traditional, definitions.
Yeah. Urban Dictionary describes it as high intellectuals.
Yeah, we're modern mooks.
Cultured high intellectuals.
We're not the traditional mooks. We're your modern mooks. We want to, defy all labels and descriptions. We want to believe that a mook is whatever you want to believe a mook is in this day and age.
Sure.
Yeah.
So today we're doing an episode on, we're picking up with kind of our family friendly. We did an animated movie episode. We did sort of a family friendly movie episode. Today we're going to do focusing on horror comedy. And, I'm sure you can all think of some funny horror movies.
It's almost like this is almost like our 3-part episode on this overall kind of trilogy of gateway horror, because it seems like
stuff that's a little bit lighter.
Yeah, and it's almost, I think as kids we grow up with, you can almost kind of put the animated programs and the family programs together. But then there's also the comedy horror, which I think a lot of people kind of get introduced to before they start getting into heavier, more legitimate horror movies.
Yeah, it was kind of hard to determine where to categorize some of these movies.
There's a bit of overlap. Yeah,
definitely some overlap. Yeah,
and we might even there might even be a few titles from our family-oriented horror episode that we might even jump back into a few of those titles if they become relevant to the discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I probably have a few more titles than you might have.
Yeah.
Should I maybe throw out?
So.
I'm not even sure. Like, where would I begin with horror comedies? I'm like, should I try to start with one of the? Well, here's one that maybe we could start with. We briefly talked about this on one of the other shows, but it's one that I know that you and me would both have things to say about. So let's get the ball rolling with this one. Young Frankenstein.
I was going to say that's a great place to start.
Yeah. And
I have a good little story about this because I think I was telling you a little bit about how my family didn't let me celebrate Halloween. And so, we'd like shut out all the lights and pretend like we weren't home, and the trick-or-treaters would come by, but we'd just pretend we weren't there. And, we'd sit around the dinner table with like a single candle burning and pretending we weren't home. But so sometimes what we would do for Halloween instead, sort of in lieu of not being able to go out trick-or-treating, was we would rent movies and stuff. And this particular Halloween, I think it was just me and my dad. We were together, and he went out and he came home and he was like, Kevin, I brought home a horror film for us to watch. And I was kind of surprised by this. I was like, wow, Dad, you brought home a horror film? And but the movie that he brought home was Young Frankenstein. And that was my introduction to it. And so my dad's always been a big Mel Brooks fan, and he especially loves the guy who plays
Gene Wilder?
Igor. No, more so
Marty Feldman.
Yeah. My dad's a big Marty Feldman fan, and he loved Monty Python and stuff. And I know Marty Feldman did some skits with those guys and stuff.
He was on a show with. It's funny. Monty Python became like the really successful one, but there was a series of British sketch comedy shows that led up to Monty Python. One of them was a sketch show that had John Cleese and some of the other guys, and Marty Feldman.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking of, actually.
Yeah, they definitely did work together. Marty Feldman easily maybe could have been part of the Monty Python crew if it wasn't for the fact that I think he was a little bit more successful than them in the late 60s.
Oh, okay.
He would have almost have been like the star of Monty Python had he had joined.
Yeah,
but he was definitely hanging around those guys. John Cleese especially was John Cleese, and I think Graham Chapman had a lot of experience working with Marty Feldman. And it was cool. I didn't know till the later years that I didn't know that there was like all these other kind of like sketch comedies with all of these guys that I loved pre-Monty Python, and some of the sketches are not bad. Some of them,
I know. No, they're hilarious.
Yeah.
And that's just it. Like, this is kind of the type of stuff that my dad used to introduce me to. And he still introduces me to it today. Like, I don't know, last time I was home, he was showing me some Marty Feldman skit with John Cleese, and they're like on a train and stuff. And Marty Feldman keeps on wanting to change seats with him and stuff. Anyway, but yeah, so that was like one of the guys that my dad really loves. That guy and Peter Sellers, he always talks.
So when he brought home when he was like, I brought home a horror movie.
I had no idea what to expect from this, but I was just like, okay, it's this black and white movie. It's older. I'm going to sit down and I guess what's interesting is my dad would often bring home these older movies that I think, he had loved from back in the day and wanted to share them with us. And to me, they were they would be, how do you call it? A little bit of, like, I wouldn't be initially interested in them. I'd be like, okay, here's like this black and white movie. Well, I'll sit through it and, it'll be like some quality time with my dad. But then I really enjoyed it. It was hilarious.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, it's got Gene Wilder in it. I recognized him, of course, from...
Were you expecting an actual horror movie or like...
I wasn't quite sure what to expect.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I was surprised that it was this... So he said, like, it's Young Frankenstein. And so I was like, okay, black and white, Frankenstein... I was kind of thinking like, I don't know, silent movie era type of monster movie. And I was not expecting it to be as much of a comedy as it was.
Right.
But I loved it. I thought it was hysterical.
Yeah.
And really enjoyed it. But I think what's interesting about it is it's made to look older than it actually is, right?
It's made to look... That's the neat thing is, and honestly, I think I probably also saw Young Frankenstein before I ever saw any of the original Universal Studio Boris Karloff movies. But that's the idea is it's almost meant to continue from the Boris Karloff Frankenstein franchise as if it could just seamlessly be a continuation of it. And it's funny because in, I think it's the third Frankenstein movie, which would be... Son of Frankenstein. It's the last one that has Boris Karloff, and there's even a young boy who's the son of Frankenstein, of Victor Frankenstein in the movie. And it's this boy who's got like blonde curly hair, and you're like, well, that's fucking Gene Wilder right there. And it was almost like, is that supposed to be the Gene Wilder character? Like, was that almost something that Mel Brooks noticed? Because Mel Brooks definitely watched those first three Frankenstein movies. Every joke in Young Frankenstein is somewhat a parody of a reference in one of those first three movies.
Okay, gotcha. That would probably help me to, have more appreciation for it as well. Even though it is still just hilarious in its...
Yeah.
In its form, like outright, it's still super funny, even if you don't get those references, I guess. But
was there ever because it kind of sounds like, I mean, obviously it was a horror comedy, but the fact that your dad kind of pitched it as a horror movie, was this kind of maybe the first time your dad brought home a horror movie to kind of be like, hey, we're going to watch this? Or was there anything you could think of before that?
Yeah, that's the first that I can really think of. And I'm trying to remember how old I was at the time. I think I might have been like 13. Yeah, maybe like 13 or something.
Which is a great age. I mean, yeah, there's nothing in Young Frankenstein that I think would scare you at 13. I'm not sure how. I think I was quite younger when I saw it. I can't remember how old I was, but yeah, it's a great. I think it's a great movie, whether you've seen the original Frankenstein movies or not. Obviously, there's maybe certain jokes that might not make as much sense, but it doesn't ruin the movie. Like, there was even some jokes that I didn't get until, say, I saw Son of Frankenstein, and then I'm like, oh, I picked up on a few new things, but the jokes are done in such a way where even if you don't know the reference, it still works and makes sense. The only real thing I can think of with the third Frankenstein movie that references in Young Frankenstein is there's that inspector character. He's that kind of guy who's got that really thick German accent that no one can understand, and he's got a fake arm that the Frankenstein tore off of him.
Okay.
And so he's kind of based on a character from the third movie. And then, there's some elements of obviously like the Bride of Frankenstein they got from Bride of Frankenstein, as well as the blind man when Frankenstein is being taken care of by a blind Gene Hackman. That's all from Bride of Frankenstein. And so these might seem almost like very random little sequences, but they're actually very much playing into the source material of the original Universal films. But yeah, I honestly think I watched Young Frankenstein before I saw any of these movies, and I loved it without even knowing any of the references.
Yeah, how old were you probably when you saw Young Frankenstein?
I want to say maybe like 7 or 8.
Oh,
maybe.
okay, so really young. Yeah.
Because
that's just it. It's very accessible for like a young kid, as well as when you're older and stuff. Like it almost doesn't matter what age you see it.
Yeah. It's kind of like the real. I feel almost like there's a lot of other movies we'll probably talk about today, but in some ways, Young Frankenstein could almost maybe be regarded as like the most beloved and respected of the horror comedies. Almost like it kind of paved the way. There was stuff before, like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and there were these kind of things. But Young Frankenstein was kind of bringing in like a new era of parodying this genre. And maybe a good segue to go from Young Frankenstein is this other movie I grew up with as a kid. And I almost kind of partner it up with Young Frankenstein because it's another movie with Gene Wilder, only there's no involvement with Mel Brooks. This was a movie that Gene Wilder wrote and directed and starred in. And it's the movie that I was saying in our last podcast. I had a movie that reminded me a lot of kind of Clue. And it's a movie called Haunted Honeymoon. And it's set in the 20s. This
is a Mel Brooks movie.
It's a Gene Wilder movie.
Oh, okay.
But it's obviously he took a lot of the sensibilities from working with Mel Brooks over the years. Like there's certain gags in Haunted Honeymoon that are kind of reinvented gags from Young Frankenstein. Like, do you remember in Young Frankenstein the part where they're stealing the corpse and then they run into like law enforcement? And it's a gag where Frankenstein's arm is kind of sticking out of the coffin, and they kind of make it look like it's Gene Wilder's arm.
Oh, okay.
It's just a quick little gag, but they kind of redo that gag in Haunted Honeymoon, but with legs.
Okay.
And so clearly, I'm assuming that both of those movies must have been Gene Wilder gags because he recreates it later on. And I have to admit, Haunted Honeymoon is not the classic that Young Frankenstein is. As a kid, I probably couldn't tell much of a difference, but I don't find Haunted Honeymoon to be nearly as good. But it does kind of involve this kind of mansion and a big dinner party, and there's a murder mystery, and there's even a character who like one of the characters is secretly a werewolf that plays into the plot. But it's very atmospheric, and there's a lot of great things about this movie. Like as far as horror comedies go, I think Haunted Honeymoon is a pretty decent one. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, if you haven't seen it, there's not too much else I really want to say.
That might be worth checking out. I mean, I'm a fan of Gene Wilder, and I'd like to see more of his stuff. It's the type
of movie I could almost even. It might be easy to find like for free on YouTube or on Tubi. I could easily see because it's kind
Haunted Honeymoon.
Haunted Honeymoon. Yeah, it's kind of been become a bit of a forgotten film. But it stars Gene Wilder and Gilda Radner, who was famously from Saturday Night Live and was his wife, before she passed away.
Oh, okay.
So they're in it together. Dom DeLuise is in the movie, and he's in drag, and he plays like the great aunt of Gene Wilder. So, you don't see a lot of movies where Dom DeLuise is in drag. And are you familiar with Dom DeLuise much?
Not a lot, no.
He's famously. He did a lot of this stuff in the 70s. He worked a lot with Mel Brooks and then did a lot of stuff in the 70s and 80s. He worked a lot with Burt Reynolds, but you'd probably know his work more he started becoming like a voice actor in the later years.
Okay.
So like All Dogs Go to Heaven is another classic example of Burt Reynolds and Dom DeLuise becoming like this kind of comedy duo. So Burt Reynolds is the main dog and Dom DeLuise is the secondary dog in All Dogs Go to Heaven.
Oh, that's who that is.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's also in, he plays the bird in The Secret of Nim.
Yeah.
He's in a bunch of, if you recognize that voice, it pops up in a lot of stuff. But there's a few things that I would recognize that from. I could probably I'm a big fan. I think Dom DeLuise is hilarious still, and I love a lot of the stuff he did with Mel Brooks back in the day. And Haunted Honeymoon isn't probably one of his funnier characters, but I don't know, if you get a kick out of seeing people in drag, I guess you'll enjoy that with Dom DeLuise. But yeah, I don't know. There's not too much more I wanted to say about that one, but it's a real neat one if you like, especially if you like 80. Like a lot of the movies on my list are going to be kind of like 80s movies, I find, because those were the ones I was watching a lot as a kid before I was allowed to watch real horror movies. Also, I just think the 80s was a really good time, not just for horror movies in general, but there was a lot of horror comedies that came in the 80s.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of comedies in general too, and
yeah.
I mean, it was a very kind of fruitful decade for a lot of that stuff. Like just a whole lot of variety, and
it was almost at a time when like the studios were going more for quantity over quality. Like the quality would slip through.
Well, yeah, there's
but
a
there
lot
was
of
a lot
shit that's been forgotten, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I'll always be browsing lists of, 80s horror films or thrillers or whatever from that time period, and there's a whole bunch that I like never heard of, but they have really cool movie like covers.
Yeah,
I'll be like, damn, I gotta check this out. Like one that I was watching, I don't know, several months ago, was called Looker. Have you ever seen Looker?
No, is this just like an 80s movie, or is
yeah,
this
it's an 80s movie, but it's
not
like
a horror movie though, right?
Kind of a
It's
suspense.
Okay, like a thriller.
Yeah, kind of. And
is the main girl a looker?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to remember what the deal is. Like they have like this ray gun that.
Oh, so it's also kind of futuristic, I guess?
Yeah. I don't know. It's a bit of a bizarre movie, but it's got a very cool movie cover. But it's just an example of something that I'd never heard of before. I think it's probably largely been forgotten.
Okay.
But if you follow some of these like 80s pages on Facebook or Instagram,
I'll have to look into
something,
anybody of note in it. Was there any name actors in this movie?
Not really that I can think of.
Okay.
Again, I think a lot of these like kind of get forgotten for a reason, but it's cool that they're out there and there's a lot to look into. But it's just a lot of it is, they're not the greatest. They're not the greatest pieces of work. Cool movie cover though, and that's the thing is you got so many of these movies that like it's true you can't you cannot judge a movie by its cover, but. Well, Albert Finney was in it. I'm just kind of looking here.
He's like quite a respected actor.
James Coburn, Susan Day, Lee Taylor Young. I just don't really like know many of these. It was directed by Michael Crichton.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the director's name, but I definitely recognize some of those actors, which kind of gives it a bit of clout. Like either it was like a big paycheck for a lot of these guys, or maybe it was half decent. I'm just surprised. I've never heard of it. Normally with these,
Michael Crichton was, I think he wrote the novel of Jurassic Park.
Oh, Michael Crichton.
Crichton.
I was wondering. I was almost gonna say. I'm like, is it Michael Crichton that you're? Well, so that even adds more. That adds even more credibility right there if it's a Michael Crichton project.
Yeah. So he wrote and directed it.
I'm actually.
Let me just read
I'm
you
amazed
this
that this is. I've never heard of this, but you've got me really interested, and I got to look up this movie.
3 or
sometime.
4 models who had plastic surgery done by Larry after a computed list are dead. Neither the cops. Hold on a minute. Neither the cops nor Larry believe they're suicides. Larry investigates and stays with the fourth model. Who's behind the lists and murders? So it's a bit of this like mystery film. And like it's an interesting sort of concept, but it's a bit of a cheesy movie when you get into it.
Would it fit as a horror comedy? This movie?
No, probably not. I wouldn't say so. But
because I'm going to say that's like Michael Crichton's not known for his humor for the most part.
No. But no, I was just using it as an example of sort of forgotten 80s movies. Which, again, there are a lot of them, but there's also, obviously, many that are well celebrated, too.
Yeah, and I mean, most of the ones on my list are not only fairly mainstream, but, like, some of them are, like, some of the most successful movies of the 80s. And those would probably be the ones that you'd be more familiar with. And I'm trying to kind of juggle between the ones that you would know with the ones that you haven't yet seen.
Well, obviously, a big one would be like Beetlejuice, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah, which I guess we've talked about on a few of the podcasts, but I don't know if we've gone into great detail about Beetlejuice. You know, we kind of broadly kind of talk about these titles a lot of the times. So
Yeah.
Yeah, Beetlejuice was had a big impact on me. Like I'd still regard it as one of my favorite Tim Burton movies. Maybe even my favorite Tim Burton movie. I don't know.
Interesting.
I was rewatching it kind of not that long ago, and maybe it's not like I don't know if I don't think I would regard it as his best movie, but it might be my favorite.
Yeah, well, and again, like when you grew up watching that and being quite familiar with that, like I grew up with an awareness of Beetlejuice, but I don't know that I ever really watched it actually at that age. I seem to have vague memories of seeing parts of it, but I didn't actually like sit down and properly watch it until my late teens, early 20s.
Did you ever watch the cartoon series?
No.
Okay. It's interesting how we talked about this on our slasher episode about how it's very hard to create an iconic character from just one movie, but Beetlejuice kind of managed to do that. It had the one movie and
super iconic too. Hey?
Yeah.
I seem to like, I almost feel like my familiarity with Beetlejuice in that era might have been almost more so attached to like advertisements and stuff, because I think that he kind of ended up getting used as a bit of a mascot for, I don't know, various brands or whatever.
Yeah.
There was probably some cross promotion of,
or even just like an image of just Halloween merch in itself, right?
Yeah, I think stuff like that.
Yeah, like I mean, I was, I guess, old enough that I remember even being in the 80s, and I dressed up as Halloween one year in the 80s. It was probably like right around that Beetlejuice kind of peak, where the movie had already come out, but then the show was, I was kind of dressed up more as like the cartoon Beetlejuice character.
Oh, okay.
But I also remember having like there was tons of toys, like, and they were really neat Beetlejuice toys at the time too. So I think I was probably just like the perfect age for Beetlejuice when they were marketing all of this stuff, because it was kind of like there was a little bit of it in the early 90s, but after the early 90s, the Beetlejuice craze really kind of died down, and after that he was really more just an image, like an icon of Halloween and horror stuff. But you could kind of tell that like the later generations of kids, there was probably some other thing that replaced Beetlejuice for that sort of element of like a spooky character, I guess. Which is why it's almost like funny how we're going to be getting this almost like 40-year later sequel. I'm almost like, who is this for? Is it going to be for the youngins, or is it for the oldies like me? I guess.
Yeah. You know, so like who actually came up with the concept of Beetlejuice? Because obviously it's very much influenced by Tim Burton's direction and that sort of thing, but he wasn't one of the writers.
No, Tim Burton had nothing to do with the concept. He was basically a director for hire, but they were like, he'd be a good director for hire. From what I remember, was the Beetlejuice was originally written as a much more straightforward horror movie. It wasn't originally a comedy, and it was, from what I remember, it was originally they were originally really considering Wes Craven to do Beetlejuice.
Oh, okay.
So
that would have been a much different movie.
It would have been a much darker, creepy movie. And then I think it was when either they brought Tim Burton on and then that decided to make it funnier, or maybe they rewrote the script and thought, okay, let's get someone like Beetlejuice to do this. But yeah, I mean, again, part of me is like interested to know like what that dark Beetlejuice movie could have been. I mean, it's the same thing that kind of happened with Gremlins, where Gremlins was another script that was originally intended as a much darker, closer to a real horror movie, that then they thought, oh, you know what, we'll make a lot more money if we can make this kind of kid friendly. So I'm not sure what that original Beetlejuice movie would have been like, but I can kind of imagine just like, yeah, just kind of, even if the story was the same, but just you kind of raise the creepy factor overall, like make just Beetlejuice kind of creepier and just
cut back on the comedy.
Yeah. And I don't think it would have been too much different. Although I don't know if Tim Burton, I think part of the zaniness is definitely Tim Burton, but yeah, you put someone like Wes Craven as the director. you would have had a much creepier movie. Maybe not, probably
Well,
not a better movie though. I don't think you could have gone more iconic than what Tim Burton did with it.
Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine it being as much of iconic property as it is now. And also, if it hadn't been Michael Keaton, like if Wes Craven had directed it, would Michael Keaton have been playing the role? That's another thing. And
Doubtful,
you would have ended up with a very different character too, hey?
Yeah, who knows who you would have gone? I mean, like, you probably wouldn't. You couldn't get Robert Englund. I mean, because you already got Freddy Krueger. You already got one striped, suited character. But that's almost like maybe that's actually why Wes Craven kind of turned it down. He's like, I already made my Boogeyman movie, And it was one
is that what happened? He turned it down. He was like, "Nah, I don't want to do this."
I don't know exactly. Either maybe he was either uninterested, or maybe they didn't negotiate the right pay rate. Maybe it was maybe the original script was a lot weaker, and he just didn't have faith in what the original script was. Because it'd be hard, like with the hit that it became, it'd be hard to imagine Wes Craven turning down like a project like that, but I don't think he was offered a comedy. He was offered probably a much more basic horror movie. And again, I think it just kind of knowing what Wes Craven was making around that time, he was just sort of like, also Wes Craven was known for writing most of his own material. So I think just kind of giving him stuff that was written by other people, unless they gave him complete creative freedom, that probably would have been the main turnoff, is just that he's like, well, this isn't mine,
Yeah.
Yeah. Should we go into some of the other movies maybe?
Sure. Sure. Let's see.
So, man, a lot of the ones on my list, I'm pretty sure are movies you haven't. There's definitely some still that I think you have seen, but most of these.
We could hang in the 80s there. Like, what if you?
Yeah.
What else have you got from the 80s? Because I've got Ghostbusters.
Well, maybe we should talk about Ghostbusters, because Ghostbusters was kind of the last title on my list that I'm like, I know Kevin's seen this one, but after we go through this movie, I really don't know if he's going to know these other movies other than by title alone.
We can have you sit here and tell me all about them.
Well, and you probably...
And I'll sit there and go,
You might have some titles of your own, too, that I might not know. But yeah, Ghostbusters, like, I don't know, what's the... Ghostbusters was, again, a really early movie that had a big impact on me. I'm wondering, when were you first introduced to Ghostbusters?
Well,
probably
again,
not as a kid, eh?
I've got, like, vague memories of a lot of these things from when I was a kid. But again, a lot of it I feel like was maybe through, like... advertisements, branding campaigns, because of course, you have all that type of stuff going on when the release of a movie is happening. Although, like, it was released before I was born too. So what year was that actually?
It was 80. It was the year I was born, so it was 84. And I mean, yeah, if you watch that movie, Ghostbusters is clearly not a movie for kids. I'm not saying it's like a serious movie.
Well, that's why we put it into the comedy category, because we were considering putting it into like the family friendly podcast.
There's cutesy things like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man for sure, and the movie's not overly disturbing, but it's actually the Ghostbusters cartoon that I think got the kid. It's the cartoon that made the kids start buying the toys and buying the costumes where they would dress up as the Ghostbusters.
Well, I think this is sort of where my awareness came from as well, because so I have two older brothers. And a lot of what my childhood experience ended up being was sort of the, what do you call it? The remnants of what they had been exposed to in the 80s.
The hand-me-down culture.
Yeah. It's like you would have like a pair of sweatpants that had Ghostbusters on them, or bed sheets, or a lunchbox or something. Yeah. And that's kind of what I mean, is there's all these things that you were sort of exposed to through merchandise.
Yeah.
And the cartoon. I think that my brothers watched the Ghostbusters cartoon, at least to some extent.
It was a great show. I like, especially in that time, like the real Ghostbusters was a great cartoon. Yeah.
One of the things that I remember having was we had like a picture book, and it was, you know how you'd get like those audiobooks that were like on cassette tape.
Yeah.
And you would play the cassette tape and then you'd like flip the pages along with the book, and there'd be like the chimes that like tell you to flip the page. So we had one of those, and that was like really kind of my main exposure to the whole Ghostbusters concept, I think.
Yeah.
So.
I remember I had, God, it's such an 80s relic. I wish I could remember the name of it. This might even be, I think you would know what I'm talking about, but this might even be before your time. It was those things where you would get these optical things you would look in through your eyes, and you would get these little like circular.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I'm
the hell
talking
do they
about?
call
Oh, I
those?
wish I
hear about them all the time nowadays.
yeah,
too,
well, and
anyway.
basically, yeah, you get these like circular.
It's like a pictogram or something.
Yeah, and you're basically just looking at these little like images through these plastic almost binoculars. And I remember I had one that was specifically for the real Ghostbusters. It was for the cartoon, and yeah, it was just like really neat. And what could I say about? Maybe going back to the toys. Like I remember one of the great toys that a lot of kids, I didn't have it, but I was jealous of my friends who did. I'd have a bunch of Ghostbuster figurines, but if your parents really cashed out, they would buy the actual like Ghostbusters building.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You know, like the fire station. Yeah. And,
cause I had a lot of like, again, we would have family friends who their kids would be like older than me, and maybe even a little bit older than my brothers too, but kind of in the same generation or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I experienced a lot of this stuff through like the older kids that I was surrounded by from family friends and whatnot.
I think even with me, I felt like a lot of the stuff I was into was kind of not meant for me, or almost like I was experiencing like the last death rattle of a franchise that was before my time. And it was everything from He-Man toys to Ghostbusters. And because honestly, like by the time I was buying Ghostbuster toys, like I said, I was born when the first movie came out. So by the time I was getting into Ghostbusters, that was like around when the sequels were coming out.
Yeah.
Which were kind of not as, like these were almost the things that were almost like killing the franchise. And so I was kind of playing with these things that were already like 5 or 6 years old at this point. I'm trying to think if there was like another example. But yeah, there was like He-Man, there was Ghostbusters. There was something else. Well, yeah, even Gremlins. I was a big fan of Gremlins, but by the time I was even aware of Gremlins, it was already the sequel that was being promoted. So, you know, it's weird because when you're a kid, you're really just, you're not even really understanding time yet.
You're gradually fading into the world, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's hard to believe that, oh, there's these things that existed before you were born.
Yeah,
But
yeah, and you're kind of just like, you're kind of gradually being exposed to all this stuff that's been culturally relevant for a few years, but you don't really have a sense of where it came from or what its legacy is. And
yeah,
because you know, you're just trying to figure out the world yourself.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, it was even confusing to understand sequels. Like you kind of were aware that there were two things, but you weren't even able to understand why one was the first one and one's the second one. You're almost just like, there's just these two movies.
Yeah, right.
And I was terrible for that as a kid. I would constantly rent the second movie before the first movie because I was just I didn't understand Roman numerals, and I was basing them on the covers, and a lot of times the sequels would have better covers than the original.
Well, like, yeah, I remember so there was like the Ninja Turtles movies, like the first Ninja Turtles and the second one. I'm pretty sure I probably watched those in chronological order. But again, when you're 4 years old, you don't really care either. You just you sit in front of a TV and it's like, there's the Ninja Turtles and they're fighting these foot soldiers and you're seeing kung fu and it's just a spectacle. And like, I don't know, I wasn't paying too much attention to what was going on in the story. It's just kind of like you're watching these characters do these things. And
well, funny enough, with the Ninja Turtle franchise, that's almost the one franchise where if you're a really young kid, you should introduce them to the Ninja Turtles backwards. Like as the Ninja Turtle movies started getting sequels, they started becoming more kiddie friendly.
Yeah. Oh,
so
I know.
It's almost
that's the thing I have an issue with. Like I watched the first one and I'm like, this is a cool movie.
Oh, it's amazing.
But the second one is like pretty lame by comparison with just some of the stupid shit that's going on.
And then
There's still good
and then there's
stuff,
the
but-
third one, right?
Yeah, I don't even like.
We don't talk about that one. But it's like, yeah, it's almost like, yeah, if you want to just keep impressing your kids, show them the worst one first.
I remember
and
the
then
funny
second,
thing
and
is
then the
like
first.
even as a kid, I thought the third one was bad.
Oh, it's really interesting how as a kid you recognize when a movie fucked up.
Yeah.
And you don't,
You
might
don't have
not
to be that old.
You,
like-
you won't be able to articulate why, but you're just like, that's, yeah, I'm not going to watch that one as much.
yeah, very true.
And just going back to Gremlins, I guess that would be another sort of franchise that I know it's probably still on your list, right?
Yeah,
You
I haven't
seen.
dug into that at all.
Gremlins is almost one of those ones where for me, it was almost like it almost could have fallen into the family category because it's mainly because I guess the Gizmo character makes it kind of cutesy enough that you could almost I don't think Gremlins was meant for young children, but that kind of pre-teenage would have been probably the perfect age
Okay.
for kids getting into Gremlins. Like Corey Feldman's in it, and if you're like around the age of Corey Feldman in that movie, that's probably like the perfect age.
Yeah.
For Gremlins. I kind of, talking about movies like Ghostbusters or Gremlins, I almost can't help but like lump the first and second movies together. Like I think of Gremlins 1 and 2 as kind of one entity. Same thing with Ghostbusters. Although Gremlins 2 is kind of a parody on the first film. It goes into full-blown comedy, while the first one, there's at least an element of seriousness that they take with it. But I love the movie so much, I don't want to really ruin anything for you. I mean, I don't know if there's much to ruin. You probably know
Well, and
the
I probably
rules.
forget stuff too, but
Yeah. But anyways, yeah, that was like Gremlins. I think as a child might have even have been, if you were to ask like childhood me what my favorite movie was, there's a very good chance I would tell you Gremlins.
Oh, okay, interesting.
So,
yeah.
So I couldn't go without mentioning it. And then also as a kid, Gremlins was also kind of a gateway for me and some of my friends with these other movies, which were kind of Gremlin. They were Gremlin knockoffs, but they were closer to bona fide horror movies, and that would be like Ghoulies and Critters.
Oh,
And,
I saw one of those Critters movies, and I just fucking thought it was god awful.
How old were you when you saw Critters?
Probably like 11.
Oh, see, that would be, to me, that's like a great age to see Gremlins, but
Okay, well that's Gremlins, but
oh,
Critters.
sorry,
I'm talking
Critters. Well, even Critters, I think
know,
it's a
I
great.
just-
But the other question is which Critters did you see, right?
This is the thing. I'm trying to remember what it was. I think it was one of the sequels. I don't think it
Yeah.
was the first one.
Well, here's an easy
Critters
way.
2, probably.
Did it end? Did you see the whole movie though?
Yes. I don't remember it well enough.
Did it
I
end
just
with like
remember
a giant ball of critters? Like they form into a giant ball that rolls and just eats anything that it rolls over?
Maybe. That sounds vaguely familiar.
All right, here's another way to easily figure it out.
I think it was probably Critters 2, just
Okay.
for the record, but go
All
ahead.
right.
What
It
else?
probably was Critters
'Cause
2.
I don't remember. I just remember being disgusted by these stupid little critter creatures.
See, but I would have
I
thought
just
as
hated
an
them.
11-year-old, you saw Critters, pre your dad telling you about Young Frankenstein as a horror movie. So Critters is a lot more of a legitimate horror movie than probably a lot of the stuff you saw up to that point, I would think, right? Like, I'm almost surprised that Critters didn't scare you a little bit if you hadn't seen enough other horror movies at that time.
I was just like disgusted by it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, here's the funny thing is Critters 3 actually has Leonardo DiCaprio in it.
Oh, really?
So he wouldn't do Hocus Pocus, but he'd do Critters 3. To be fair, Critters 3
Yeah.
was probably before Hocus Pocus. But Critters 3 is actually that was my introduction to Critters, funny enough. And it's not a good way to be introduced to the franchise. And the first one would be the way to go. But it introduced me to DiCaprio.
How many of those are there then?
There's 4. There's 4 Critters movies.
I
But
should like go and watch them and just bring that back because I watched it at a friend's house. Like we were having a sleepover
yeah. and
we watched whatever one it was. Again, I kind of feel like it was number 2. But
Yeah. Well, they're all campy movies. I mean, even this is why I kind of say like that these are again kind of gateway horror movies for kids
Yeah.
because they're a little bit more intense than Gremlins, but still like, I mean, clearly as an 11-year-old, you were able to handle it. Right. So,
Yeah.
and then, yeah, I don't know if you were familiar very much with Ghoulies. Ghoulies was even more horror related possibly, but I just remember that was a movie that anytime I would go to my uncle or my grandparents' place, They would always rent Ghoulies for me because it would be like, I want a horror movie. And they'd be like, well, here's the kid-friendly one. And it really wasn't all that kid-friendly, but I'd watched it so many times, it didn't matter after a certain point. But yeah, so I have a lot of nostalgia with, all these kind of little creepy crawly movies like Gremlins, Critters, Ghoulies. They're very much made kind of looking back, like they're almost too gory to be kid movies. But
well, it is interesting that they had like 3 different series that were so similar concepts in that way.
Yeah.
I don't know how similar they are in actuality, but I kind of get the impression that it's like, okay, you have these tiny little creepy characters that are like these little freak things that.
So Ghoulies was actually in production pre-Gremlins.
Okay.
So that was just a lot of people accused Ghoulies of being a Gremlin knockoff, but it was actually in production before Gremlins. But because Gremlins was such a huge success, they were like, oh, okay, well, we're going to fucking milk this now. We're going to make sequels. And Critters, I would say, is a bona fide Gremlins ripoff.
Okay,
it's not a bad one, but Critters is clearly like, Gremlins is a big hit. We're going to do our Gremlins now.
Yeah.
Funny enough is all those other movies, Ghoulies and Critters had a lot more sequels while Gremlins only had the one sequel, which is weird. Because I love it. I actually think Gremlins 2 might be better than the original.
Maybe the thing is that it wasn't as much of like an exploitation, you know?
Well,
obviously Critters was. It was like a cash grab or whatever, whereas Gremlins was maybe more like, we've got an actual story we're trying to tell here, and we actually care about the authenticity of this movie.
Yeah, I think part of it was also a lot of people felt that they just waited a bit too. It's the same thing kind of with Ghostbusters too. It's funny because Gremlins and Ghostbusters came out in the same year, and then their sequels came out more or less in the same year. Mm-hmm. And I think for both of those movies, they just kind of said that they kind of waited a bit too long. Like there's kind of this like fine line where you almost want, if a movie becomes a big hit, you almost don't want to wait more than 2 or 3 years for the sequel, because if 5 or 6 years go by, it's like the hype's kind of died down, and it's almost like that audience has possibly moved on.
Yeah.
And in many ways, Gremlins 2 is far superior to the first movie, at least like the design of the Gremlins, and like Rick Baker does the Gremlins in the sequel, and they clearly had a lot more money. But they also went bonkers with it. Like I think Joe Dante didn't want to make the movie unless they allowed him to do whatever he wanted, which is why the sequel is very cartoony. But that's again part of what I love about it. Like it's full of movie references and cameos, and it even like makes fun of the first movie. Yeah, I don't know. I think Gremlins 2 is a fairly underrated movie. I think you would. I think you'd enjoy both movies, but I actually think you'd probably enjoy the second one even more.
Now, you've often told me that they're more Christmas movies than
the first one.
The first one is okay.
It's just that it's
I've
set
got to make
around.
a point of watching it at Christmas time.
Are you familiar with Gizmo? Do you know the Gizmo character? He's like the cute, fluffy.
Yeah.
So he's like a Christmas gift.
Okay.
So they don't delve deep into Christmas, but it's just that's like the setting. It's another thing to kind of play with, where they're kind of parodying. I think in the marketing, it was originally they tried to originally like trick people into thinking Gremlins was a wholesome holiday film. And then you realize, it's kind of a parody of those sort of It's a Wonderful Life kind of movies, where like a kid gets a cute little gift, and they were like, is this going to be more like E.T.? And they're like, nope. No, they become monsters. But yeah, the second one, it basically takes place in the summer in New York. Nothing Christmas related to the second one. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on the subject of Ghostbusters there, it's like those movies are I would almost compare them to like a Back to the Future or something, in the sense that they're like these adventure films, but that kind of have comedy going on, but they're more dynamic than just being like a comedy horror. There's a whole kind of adventurous spirit to
yeah, well, all
movies.
those guys were like more known for, like, they were all famous from Saturday Night Live, and they were kind of making these, I don't know if I'd call them sex comedies. It's like almost any comedy from the 80s was kind of a sex comedy, but they were like they were comedies meant for young adults. And Ghostbusters, I think, was them trying to continue that fan base, although also recognize, I don't think they realized the golden ticket that they had with Ghostbusters. I think they thought, oh, this will be like a hit, but they didn't realize, oh, this is a really iconic franchise in the making.
That's so often the way that it is with those movies, right? The way that they start is it's like a funny idea. And I mean, even kind of going back to Ninja Turtles, like how random that idea was.
I think that was done as a joke. Like it was like the title, right? They were just like, what's the most ridiculous title?
Yeah, and they just sort of started developing it, and then they like turned it into something, and kind of ran with it or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's hilarious how these things come about. There's sort of these bizarre offbeat ideas that turn into something that ends up really resonating with people for whatever reason. Like it's hard to even pinpoint what it is about them, but there's something very appealing about Ghostbusters.
Are you familiar with the original idea of what Ghostbusters was?
No, not really.
So it was always Ghostbusters was always Dan Aykroyd's brainchild. He comes from a family and a history of parapsychologist people in his family. Like I think it's like his grandfather. They would do these seances and like they actually took this stuff very seriously. Like Dan Aykroyd.
Okay, that's interesting.
Dan Aykroyd is famous for being very serious about parapsychology, and it's almost like his character is the like legit character in the Ghostbusters, in that the stuff that he's spewing a lot of the times, like there's almost some basis for it, you know? Like he didn't make up words like ectoplasm. It was based on his own knowledge of these things.
Was he involved in writing the movie?
Oh, he wrote the whole thing. Yeah.
Oh, like by himself?
Well, so the original concept of Ghostbusters, he wrote completely on his own. What happened was it was way too ambitious. It was an unfilmable movie. It was like the script was like 300 pages. Like it would have been like a 3-movie trilogy, essentially. Right, it was set in the future, and it was going to be Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi was going to be the other Ghostbuster. I think it was just going to be the two of them. And then when John Belushi died, that fucked up everything. And then also the studios were like, this is also just insane. Like, this is too huge. It's set in the future. It was almost like Guardians of the Galaxies as ghost hunters. So he rewrote it with Harold Ramis, who famously played Egon, who was also a really famous comedy writer. He wrote Animal House and also directed a lot of comedies. So they kind of retooled the script together into more like what it became. The only other thing that was maybe noteworthy, and it makes sense when you think about it, but the character Winston, I want to say, the Black Ghostbuster, that was a role that was written for Eddie Murphy. That was supposed to, because Eddie Murphy had just done Trading Places with Dan Aykroyd, so they had a rapport. Eddie Murphy was also the hottest new thing from SNL, and you kind of watch the movie and you're kind of like, why are like these like 3 comedy guys, and then there's kind of like Ernie Hudson, who's not a comedic actor, and it's because it was supposed to be Eddie Murphy, who I guess turned it down to do Beverly Hills Cop, and I don't know if it was the wrong mistake, because Beverly Hills Cop and Ghostbusters both became 2 of some of the most successful movies of that year.
Yeah.
And obviously one movie stars Eddie Murphy as opposed to being, the 4th member. So that's probably another reason why he was more interested in doing Beverly Hills Cop. But my God, how amazing would Ghostbusters have been if they had Eddie Murphy as the 4th Ghostbuster, right? Also, Paul Rubens was originally meant to be Gozer. I bet did you know that?
No.
Gozer the Gozerian. Yeah. He was going to be Pee Wee Herman, and then
wow.
And then I guess maybe Pee Wee was busy doing Pee Wee's Big Adventure. That's the only thing I could think of why he would turn it down.
Was that movie that early? I guess it kind of was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Damn.
And you know what?
Just imagine what would have been.
A lot of people give a lot of hate to Ghostbusters 2. I'm actually a big fan of Ghostbusters 2. Maybe in this day, maybe with the newer Ghostbusters, maybe Ghostbusters 2 is getting a lot more respect.
Well, sometimes that's what it is, right? It takes a little bit of time for these things to catch on and be sort of appreciated for what they are.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's the classic that the first movie is, but I don't think it's far off. Like, tonally, it's very close to the first movie. Still written by Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis. I think it was just they had big shoes to fill. Like, Ghostbusters was huge. Yeah. And also Bill Murray I don't think Bill Murray's ever wanted to be in any of the Ghostbuster movies. It was really hard to get him for Ghostbusters 2, but he reluctantly came on board for it. But yeah, I think it's great. I think it's got a great villain. I like the premise of Vigo in the painting. And there's some really great moments in it. Like I almost think of them as one movie in many ways. There's another movie. Well, I was going to bring up another title, but I don't know if you have another title. Maybe.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So, I don't think you've seen this movie, but you are familiar with the main character in this movie. And so this is Elvira, the Mistress of the Dark.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah. I think Elvira was probably one of my earliest crushes.
Makes sense.
I was a big fan of Elvira, and like me and my sister, we would watch a lot. Like we would watch a lot of these horror comedies, but Elvira was a big one that we would rewatch a lot.
Well, and she's got a lot of different material too, right? Like you can watch because she had her whole TV series.
Yeah, well, she was a horror hostess originally, and and this was kind of like her big movie. Like this was kind of like her big break. That I guess the movie didn't really do all that well, which is why the idea was because she was again. It was probably because of Paul Rubens that reminded me of Elvira, because they both started in the Groundlings together. That was a sketch comedy improv group where they both came up with their characters, Elvira and Pee Wee Herman. And so Elvira cameos in the Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and Pee-wee was supposed to cameo in Elvira, but wasn't able to. But it's almost like, they both were birthed in the same universe almost. And I think the idea was that had Elvira been a bigger success as a movie, they would have maybe made more sequels. And it's a shame because it's a really decent movie. It's a really fun horror comedy, and there's even like certain elements where the movie gets kind of genuinely like spooky occasionally. There's tons of boob jokes because that's kind of Elvira's shtick.
You would expect nothing less.
A lot of sexual stuff that went way over my head as a kid watching it. But I don't know. That's kind of like the great thing is like you can kind of show kids these movies, and it's not gonna. Yeah,
they're not gonna. It's not so explicit that they're gonna be exactly. And the adults can appreciate it and have a laugh. But, and then you can grow up with it, and like again, sometimes these things they remain relevant to the generation that they were targeted at. Like if that movie was targeted to kids, as you get older, there's a reason to keep coming back to it, you know?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And I mean, she's such a icon, like
oh, totally,
in her own right. So it's like
I remember they tried to like find a new Elvira. Like years ago, they were like, "Oh, we're gonna like have this like auditions and find who's the next Elvira," and it kind of
needs to just become its own new thing.
Yeah, well, in many ways, Elvira was a like Vampira. I think it's Vampira, right? From like the 50s. She tried to sue Elvira in the 80s for stealing her character. Oh, because they were both horror hostesses and they both had similar gimmicks, but they were different characters. Like Elvira is almost like a valley girl in a goth costume, but she's very California and sarcastic and goth. And that's not what Vampira was, almost playing it a little bit more straight back in the day. Like
more of a actual kind of horror.
She was still tongue in cheek. Like she knew that her audience was children.
Okay.
But she was more like sultry and seductive. She was almost like trying to play it a little bit more straight than Elvira, who's just kind of going for the more comedic valley girl kind of persona. And like even like the hair, like they both have black hair, but like the wigs are very different. And like you gotta completely rip off a character if you're gonna get sued for it. So Vampira didn't successfully sue Elvira, but yeah, it's just going back to them trying to find a new Elvira. Like long story short, it just seems like whoever they did get wasn't very good, and they just scrapped it. And they were like, I think Cassandra Peterson just kind of accepted that Elvira is probably going to die with her, and she somehow has managed to like preserve herself so well. She still can pull off the Elvira look. Like,
yeah, well, it helps.
She's one of like the hottest women in the 70s I can think of. Yeah.
It helps when you have some of those things like the heavy makeup and the wig and
Yeah, no, totally.
whatnot.
Yeah. You recognize her age much more when she's not in the costume, but I would rather her just continue Elvira till she can't, and then maybe in another 10 or 20 years, we have somebody else who's kind of inspired by Elvira, the way Elvira was inspired by Vampira.
That's probably exactly what you need, right? And someone who's going to come and do their own take on it, not like some studio that's like, okay, let's try and seek out the right replacement. It's almost like you need somebody who's an artist to come and put their own take on.
Well, it's like one person like created a character, and anybody else who steps in is just doing a half-ass impersonation of what that person invented.
Exactly.
And
it's just not going to be the same. It's not going to have the same authenticity.
Yeah. But anyways, I won't go too much more on Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, but it's a great 80s horror comedy that if you haven't seen it, and if you enjoy especially like 80s horror comedies, Elvira is a classic as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah. Do you want to throw out a title?
Well, why don't we hang it? Like, do you have more from the 80s right now, or?
Yeah, most of mine are from the 80s, actually.
Well, let's keep in this 80s trend that we're going at. And
all right, here's another one that to me this title is a classic, but I don't know if you've ever heard of this movie I'm about to say. Transylvania 65000.
Oh, yes, I've heard of that movie.
You know, the old classic. Yeah, so so this was a movie, again, I watched it a lot as a kid, and it was written by one of Mel Brooks's co-writers, who I guess branched out and decided to try to make a movie totally on his own. And you kind of you get a little bit of the Mel Brooks sensibilities, but you're also like, yeah, this guy's not Mel Brooks. But the thing about the movie, there's a few things that are kind of neat about this movie. For some reason, they decided to actually shoot this in Transylvania. So it's authentically an actual Transylvania film.
That's the only way to do it, man.
It's so weird because like it was so unnecessary, but the fact that they do it does bring a little level of credibility to the movie, you know?
Yeah.
Like when you see some of these villagers, you're like, shit, that's like an actual Transylvanian villager. The other great thing about this movie is it's got like a phenomenal cast of kind of major actors who just kind of were right about to make it big, but hadn't yet. So here's some of the names in this movie have, so Gina Davis and Jeff Goldblum, I think actually first met on this movie. They made 3 movies together and they got married, but this was the movie I'm pretty sure that they met on.
And had they done much before this? Because this was like, what year was this?
I'm going to say like 1984.
Okay.
Maybe 1983, maybe even 1985. But like, so this is pre Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis, The Fly.
Yeah, right.
They were kind of like, it's like Gina Davis was in Tootsie and Jeff Goldblum was in a handful of kind of small movies, but still hadn't quite made it big yet. Michael Richards, who later went on to play Kramer in Seinfeld, is a character in the movie. I mean, there's certain names that I would know, but I don't know if a lot of our listeners or you would be familiar with, like people like Carol Kane. There are a lot of kind of like character actors who you don't see quite as much these days. I'm trying to think that I feel like I'm forgetting another maybe fairly well-known actor. I mean, I don't know, Ed Begley Jr. It's Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis are probably like the ones who stand out the most as far as name actors.
Yeah.
But
gotcha.
it's just a really, I don't know. It's weirdly like I would always kind of lump it together with Young Frankenstein and Haunted Honeymoon as just these kind of childhood horror comedies that I watched a lot. I won't say too much about it, but it's just, you know, it's nice because like they cover all the monsters. There's like a vampire, there's a wolf man, there's a mad scientist. Did I say Frankenstein? There's a Frankenstein character. There's a mummy. And so, yeah, it just has a lot of like the classic tropes that I dig, where I remember even talking to somebody a long time ago about this movie. Like we were both surprised that the other person knew about it. And we're just like, man, like where are the Transylvania 65000s of today? Like they don't really make a lot of these kind of horror comedies like they used to.
Yeah.
But it's, I don't know if it's aged all that well, but if you're just dying for horror comedies and you've seen all these other ones we're talking about, maybe check this one out. It's I don't know. Yeah, for me, it's probably more nostalgic than anything. But yeah, we can move along from that that one. I've given that a nice little bit of time. But there's still some. I mean, I don't know. I've talked about Teen Wolf briefly in one of the other episodes. Teen Wolf, I mean, it's not even really.
This is that Michael J. Fox movie, right?
It's not even like a horror comedy. Like, that's how unnecessary the wolf part is of this. Like, it's closer to just a teen comedy than to even call it a horror comedy. There's not like a single person that dies in this thing. It's just like, pretend that Michael J. Fox is taking steroids. I mean, you'd get a very similar movie than him being a werewolf who's good at basketball. But again, I loved werewolf movies as a kid, and so I couldn't really watch genuine werewolf movies. So I would get stuck with these Teen Wolf movies. Mm-hmm. So there's Teen Wolf 1 and 2. First one's Michael J. Fox. Second one's Jason Bateman. And I can't even imagine, like, if you're like a young person listening to our show, and if you just happen to enjoy old 80s movies, then I think you probably will enjoy Teen Wolf. If you're not a fan of 80s movies, I don't know why you'd be watching these films, but
yeah, probably not a good idea to watch 80s movies if you're not into the 80s.
yeah, it's I mean, there's certain 80s movies that are so good that they transcend the era, but some of these comedies are very much of the era.
Yeah, like if you watch like Indiana Jones and stuff, it's like you don't need to be an 80s film. Even like Back to the Future, I think even you don't have to be like hardcore into the 80s to appreciate those movies.
Yeah, Back to the Future is almost more like a 50s movie in a weird way when you think about it, right? So there's another movie I was going to just because I'm still trapped in the 80s. I might be for most of this podcast.
That's okay.
But it's a movie
we like spending time there.
Well, there's one that I think I've recommended to you before, and it seems like you're interested in checking it out. And it's Joe Dante's The Burbs.
Oh yeah. I've been wanting to watch that for a long time. But so that's a horror film.
Well, it's not. I mean, it's a comedy that somewhat is referential on horror, but not your traditional. It's not like it's parodying vampires or monsters. It's more about like it's like making fun of paranoia and thinking like it's almost a little bit more psychological, where it's like a what if your neighbors might be serial killers.
This reminds me a little bit of Disturbia.
Oh, actually, that's not a bad comparison. I always think of I always connect Disturbia with like Rear Window.
Well, and I was even going to say like Rear Window a little bit too. Is like it's a similar sort of thing, right? Where you're maybe seeing sort of suspicious things go on with your neighbors or the people around you, and then it starts to get to your imagination, and the paranoia sets in. And
well, yeah, and the whole movie you're basically like, because Tom Hanks He's taking a week off from work. He's vacation. He's deciding to stay home, and he's bored. He's got nothing to do, and he's just such like he's looking for a nervous breakdown, essentially. Like he's such a high-strung guy that even on his week off where he can relax, he can't relax. He has to create an issue where he starts getting paranoid about his neighbors. So the whole movie, you're kind of like, okay, are the neighbors serial killers, or is Tom Hanks just losing his mind? And so it keeps you guessing the whole movie, which is really fun. And it's made by Joe Dante, who I think has made some of the most classic 80s movies. It's kind of like the last...
You're a big Joe Dante fan. You've mentioned a lot of his stuff.
Well, he did the Gremlins movies. You mentioned Explorers, so,
Oh, he did that movie.
He did do the Explorers, yeah.
Frick.
Yeah.
That's pretty great.
But it's also because a lot of his movies tend to be genre films. A lot of them are kind of sci-fi or horror movies, which is why he kind of pops up a lot when we do these channels. But yeah, he's like... I don't know. He's almost like, I've always said he's almost like if you combine Martin Scorsese with Steven Spielberg, you get...
I was going to say there's definitely some Spielberg stuff going on there.
Yeah.
In that it sounds like he does a lot of stuff that's very kind of imaginative.
Well, he even made so Spielberg was really impressed with The Howling to the point that he was like, you're like me. I want you to start making Amblin movies. And so like they first collaborated on the Twilight Zone movie, but then, Gremlins was produced by Spielberg. I think Explorers might have been produced by Spielberg and Inner Space. So he was kind of like, oh yeah, this is a guy who can make the movies that I want to... This is a guy who can make movies the way I would probably be close to making them if I had the time to make all of these films. It's a shame because the 90s, just didn't seem to be like Joe Dante's era. Kind of like a lot of these guys, like John Carpenter, Joe Dante, like they just thrived in the 80s. And then the 90s, they had some hits, but just sometimes it's just a couple of sort of failures and Hollywood stops offering you things. Joe Dante also did Small Soldiers, which you brought up.
Oh.
Yeah. That's probably to me the last, that's like the last classic Joe Dante film would be Small Soldiers. Okay. But yeah, no, I think you'd really like The Burbs.
Yeah, I've been wanting to watch it for a long time.
Yeah. To me, it actually ages like the more, like the older I get, the more I appreciate the humor in The Burbs. Because as a kid, you're not really laughing at the movie. You're just enjoying it.
Okay.
And then you get older and then you're just like, I don't know, laughing at just Tom Hanks, just like slowly just losing it. But yeah, it's almost not a horror movie, but I feel like it fits in with the horror comedy genre. If it's not horror, it's weird to call it like a horror thrill or a thriller comedy. So
yeah,
I say horror comedy. Well, here's another 80s one. I think you'll like it. I've briefly talked about it a bit. It's made by Neil Jordan, who did Interview with a Vampire that we both love.
Yeah.
And it's a movie called High Spirits. And again, it's just another movie I saw at a very young age.
You were telling me about this a little while ago.
Yeah, it's set in Ireland. It might even be filmed in Ireland because Neil Jordan's Irish, so who knows?
Yeah.
But it's American actors, and it's about this Peter O'Toole runs this haunted hotel that's not even really haunted. He just bullshits it because it kind of helps get the tourists over. So all these Americans show up at this haunted hotel to check it out. And like they kind of slowly discover, oh, it's all bullshit. Like Peter O'Toole has these people kind of faking ghost stuff. But then slowly they realize that the haunted mansion hotel actually does have genuine ghosts in it. Mm-hmm. And again, it's another movie where there's a few moments at least where it's almost like bona fide a little bit creepy, even though it's for the most part a very comedy-based movie. I mean, it fucking stars Steve Guttenberg, but visually it's really nice. Like it's just the fact that it's made by Neil Jordan. It doesn't have the beauty of Interview with a Vampire or The Company of Wolves, but it's still a very neat, atmospheric movie for a horror comedy.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So yeah, I won't go too much more on it, but yeah, High Spirits. It's, again, all of these were movies that I just watched. I would just shuffle all of these 80s movies. I would rotate them around, and these were the movies I would live off of until I was able to actually watch real horror movies.
Yeah. So kind of in like your younger or kind of mid-childhood era.
Yeah, like these were all kind of things I saw before the age of 10.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So earlier we'd been talking about, not in the podcast, but just in our conversation, we were talking a little bit about Dracula, Dead and Loving It, which I think is also from the 80s.
90s, actually.
Oh, that's 90s.
We're diving into the 90s now.
Maybe it's time to move on into the later decade.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty good for 8. The only other thing from the 80s we could have touched on would be Little Shop of Horrors, but I think
that's a weird one. Like,
because it's so not scary, right?
Well, and it's so not a Halloween movie.
No.
I would say that's like, and that's a musical as well, which is unusual for you. Like, you're not usually. I
mean, I like the songs in it, but they're not my favorite part of the movie. I mean, there's always the part where you're occasionally like, oh, we could fast forward this, I think, but I don't think they're bad. At least some of the songs. Actually, here's a little trivia bit. I found out not that long ago that the songwriting team who did Little Shop of Horrors were the songwriting team who did a lot of the classic Disney animations. Huh. So they did Little Mermaid and I think Beauty and the Beast and
Aladdin. Are you talking about Howard?
I know they did
Alan Menken and Howard Ashman?
I know it's the guys who did Little Mermaid for sure. And in fact, here's an interesting thing. Do you remember the Little Shop of Horror songs pretty well?
No. I've only actually watched the movie like once. There's
this one song that Audrey sings. Audrey's like the sort of love interest in the movie. And she's singing a song where she's sort of fantasizing about her future with Seymour, like where they'll get a little house together and raise some kids. And the song is called Somewhere That's Green. Mm-hmm. And part of, oh God, do I have to start singing now?
Yes.
Part of the song is kind of like, somewhere that's green. And like, I realized, and the other people have talked about this, it's very close to a part of our world. And I'm just sort of like, and then it's the same singer, it's the same songwriting team. So I mean, these are guys who, they know how to make catchy songs.
Yeah, I have a feeling that it probably is Alan Menken and
I think you're right. I think it would be those guys.
They were quite prolific and, just did a ton of high-profile stuff. Very accomplished songwriting duo.
Yeah. But I think the thing I'm most impressed with Little Shop of Horrors is the puppeteering of the plant itself. It's flawless. It is...
Yeah.
Nothing. The best CGI I don't think could have come close to that, because you're also just aware that, wow, like they did that for real and how complicated that must have been. And I think they slowed it at a slow frame rate and then sped it up. That's the only reason why the plant is so fluid with its puppetry. But again, directed by Frank Oz, the secondhand man to Jim Henson. So, of course there's going to be some great puppeteering in that movie.
Yeah, totally.
But a whole bunch of great cameos by a bunch of the classic 80s comedians of the time, Rick Moranis, Bill Murray, Steve Martin, John Candy. I don't know. Other than that, we should move on to the 90s, eh?
Yeah.
Dracula Dead and Loving It.
Yeah, so I didn't actually see this movie, but this is something that somebody had mentioned to me recently, and I was like, well, frick, I love Leslie Nielsen comedies. Like, I'd probably enjoy this. So I have to watch it, but you're familiar with it, hey?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it obviously gets compared a lot to Young Frankenstein because this was sort of Mel Brooks's follow-up in many ways. And I would say, like, to our listeners, it's the same thing I would tell Kevin, which is that the more Dracula movies you've seen, the more you might appreciate this movie. But the only ones that I feel you'd really need to see would be the original Bela Lugosi Dracula and Bram Stoker's Dracula. If you see those two movies, you're pretty much good. You don't need anything else. Yeah. And probably more so the Bela Lugosi one.
So this is like it's a horror comedy, but is this like a kid-friendly sort of movie, or is it more like for an adult audience?
I mean, other than the fact that every Mel Brooks movie is loaded with sex jokes.
Right.
But I mean, so was Young Frankenstein, right? So
yeah, I mean, even like Spaceballs has like some.
Yeah. My thing is as a kid, you either don't get the joke or you do. So if you get the joke, you were old enough for it.
And even if you do like sort of get the joke, it's your exposure to sort of some of those sexual things is not like it's not like scarring to you.
Well, it's like by definition, if you got the joke, you by definition were old enough to get the joke, right?
I guess so.
And if you weren't old enough to get the joke, then you don't get the joke, and so there's no harm done either, right? And so, but I will say it's the fact that it's technically Mel Brooks's last movie, and I think because it was the 90s sensibility, he probably did go a little bit raunchier than Young Frankenstein, just because he was trying to keep up with the times he was competing with 90s comedies of the era. So it might have been a little bit more heavy on the sex jokes. Also, Dracula is just a more sexual, there's more things to sexualize with Dracula than Frankenstein. Right. But there's nothing like, it's hard to even say horror comedy. It's like the emphasis is this is a comedy making fun of horror movies. There is nothing scary in Dracula Dead and Loving It.
Yeah.
Nothing that I can think of that comes even close that would scare a kid.
Yeah. And the humor might not even be particularly that dark.
No.
It's not like it's not exactly like dark humor. It's just kind of
There's one sequence that has a lot of fake blood, but it's so cartoony. It's not like disturbing.
Yeah.
I don't think that would even freak out any kids. I don't know. I remember this was like a movie that they would air on television a lot in the 90s. I remembered. And so, yeah, it's, I don't know. It's, again, some people just like to rip on this movie because I think they want to compare it to Young Frankenstein, that is so kind of honored in the horror comedy genre.
Yeah, sort of untouchable in a way, you know?
But maybe as a whole, Young Frankenstein is better, but there's so many memorable moments in Dracula Dead and Loving It that it's definitely worth watching, like just to remember the things that are memorable about it. And I won't ruin any of the jokes, but it's just, yeah, they're jokes that just seem so obvious when you're familiar with the Dracula movies, but until you see them in Dracula Dead and Loving It, you're like, why didn't I think of that? But I think you'll have a lot of fun with that movie.
Okay,
Yeah.
I definitely want to check it out because I'm a huge fan of Leslie Nielsen movies, and I do tend to like parodies too, which we're sort of treading into like a bit of parody territory
Also,
now, and I would like to mention Scary Movie. Because, you know, if we want to talk something a little more modern, I mean, it's like 20 years old now.
Well, and only that, but it became a real franchise in its own right.
Yeah.
Maybe not a great franchise, but a franchise nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, like, I at least got, like, laughs out of the first 3,
yeah,
you know?
Yeah. I would actually say the first 3 are genuinely good.
Yeah, and they do start to make fun of a lot of other movies that were not horror movies, but... But I mean, eventually they're just making fun of everything.
Well, it's almost like they continued the franchise in an era where there wasn't necessarily a lot of great horror movies to work off of, you know?
Yeah.
So it almost like they got desperate to be like, oh God, I guess we'll focus on King Kong or things that became even completely non-related to horror.
Yeah, well, it started just like making fun of things in pop culture and stuff too. Like I remember they were like making fun of Tom Cruise jumping on Oprah's couch in the 3rd one.
Yeah. And there was always a little bit, even in Scary Movie 1, you know, there's The Matrix was a big hot movie. There would always be a few little small references sprinkled in, but for the most part, they were focused on horror parodying that eventually just became like just pop culture parodying, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I got as far as the 4th movie, and I remember that the 4th one was a bit rough.
Yeah, I didn't get beyond the 3rd one, to be honest. But I still, like, you know, found some good laughs in that one. It's just, you know, the first one is by far the best.
Well, the first 2 are made by the Wayans brothers, and then the 3rd one is actually made by I think one of the Zucker brothers.
Who
you know, was famous for essentially inventing this genre. Like they did Airplane and Naked Gun and all of those movies.
Is that right?
That's why Leslie Nielsen is in the 3rd one.
Fuck, man, those are so great though.
Yeah,
like I love the Airplane movies and like tons of, like Naked Gun.
Hot Shots.
Hot Shots is hilarious. Did you ever see Wrongfully Accused?
Yeah. I don't know if I don't know if the Zucker brothers actually, like, that might have been one where other people were kind of picking off the style from the Zucker, because Leslie Nielsen's in it, right? But again, even for one that they weren't involved with, it was quite. Again, you need to see, as long as you see The Fugitive, you're good for Wrongfully Accused.
Yeah.
But I'm a big fan of a lot of those movies, and it's weird because like Scary Movie was kind of like the last kind of good ones, but they also kind of killed it after that. Like after that, parody movies were kind of terrible after that.
I know, it's so true. Like I haven't seen a good
Walk
parody
Hard.
movie
Walk Hard would maybe be the last one I can think of that I enjoyed as like as a bona fide parody film. But I loved how they also had, like, you know, the first Scary Movie is clearly Scream and a little bit of I Know What You Did Last Summer. And then the second one's like more like the haunted house movies. So I like how like each one, it's kind of like its own thing. But then like even by the 3rd one, there's a lot of Signs, the movie Signs parodies in the 3rd one.
Oh, right.
But eventually the movies just started breaking off into just being like just an assortment of references without having like kind of like a focus the way that the early ones did.
I think they made like some references to The Grudge and The Ring, stuff like that. But man, that first one was super hilarious.
Yeah.
I just think, and again, you know, maybe it's partially, it succeeded because there were some very iconic, it's almost like the parody can only be as good as the movie that it's parodying. That's right, you know?
Yeah.
And since Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer and stuff were these iconic movies of the time, there was a lot to work with, a lot to draw from, but you can only kind of go so far with it. And
well, that's why I think the first, in many ways, the first Scary Movie was like the most bona fide hit, because it was like, oh, we're truly parodying a very popular movie, almost scene by scene. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's what I loved so much, because at that particular time, Scream was so burnt into my head that I love that they weren't just parodying the famous scenes, they were even parodying like the forgettable scenes in Scream.
Right.
But they were plot points, you know, and What else was I gonna say though about it? See, I think the problem was like, yeah, by the time you got to like, I don't know if it's the fourth or maybe the fifth movie, but like they started parodying things like The Village, like movies that were actually kind of not even hits themselves. Like a lot of people were kind of annoyed and disappointed by The Village, and they're like, well, we're gonna parody this one, and it's like, well, yeah, but we hate the Village. Why are you gonna use that as your focus? Like, do the ones that we like. Like, it's better to make fun of the movie that we like. Like, it's almost easy to parody the movie that everybody knows what's disappointing about it, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's like, I kind of feel like if they kept going, we probably would have had, like, Conjuring, scary movie references. But I think it kind of died out before it got to that sort of stage.
Paranormal Activity, stuff like that.
I think there might actually be a Paranormal Activity spoof. It's just, I think it's terrible. Like, it was a... they quickly made it and just threw it out there. But I'm almost positive that there is some sort of a Paranormal Activity spoof movie.
Well, that was also where, like, there's like Blair Witch references and stuff in the scary movie, as I recall. I think there's even a Blair Witch. That was another huge movie that came out around that era, right?
Well, Blair Witch also got a spoof. I think like anything that was a found footage movie, they were like, oh, well, we could spoof that with no money also.
Yeah.
And, but again, like I was always like, well, I don't know. It's like, I would always pay attention to the people who made these movies. And I'm like, oh, these are made by nobodies. What are the odds of this thing being any good? It's got a horrible rating. And so that's why, it's good to see if it's the Zucker brothers or the Wayans brothers. Because, it can make a difference. Technically, I guess anybody can make a spoof film. But eventually that's what they became. They started just becoming like, I think it really kind of the bottom of the barrel was like a spoof movie of spoof movies. And it was just like, oh my, just kill this already. Like, you don't even know what this is anymore. And I guess that's where we're at. I think they are still making spoof movies, but they're made so low budget that.
I don't think they're so much mainstream as they were. Cause Scary Movie was very popular to watch as a teen.
And there were some A-list actors.
Not Another Teen Movie.
Yeah.
Or they were kind of doing a whole bunch of them. There was like Epic Movie and there
was like a Spartan one. It was like Meet the Spartans or something like that. It was just, there's probably a Pirates of the Caribbean spoof film.
Well, I think that Epic Movie was making fun of a lot of like those sort of period swashbucklers and things like that.
The Ben-Hurs of the time.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on? I'm just backtracking it a little bit now. I'm going back to the 90s.
Yeah, sure.
Army of Darkness.
Oh, that movie is great, actually.
Yeah.
I was so impressed by that movie. And so I haven't seen like the Evil Dead movies, but I was just kind of dropped right into Army of Darkness, not really knowing anything about.
I thought you saw the first Evil Dead.
No.
Oh, dude. Okay, so see, I'm glad I brought this up because the Evil Dead movies are some of my all-time favorite films, but my introduction to the franchise was Army of Darkness, as I think a lot of people's were.
So that's what it was for me,
and
too.
I had no idea that there was any other movies, so I just watched it as a standalone horror comedy.
Yeah.
And I loved it. Although looking back, it actually might be my least favorite of the trilogy, just because I love the other Evil Dead so much. But I would love if you could manage to watch those Evil Dead movies before Halloween this year, because they're just so many people love the second movie in particular, and yet I find the first movie incredibly inspiring. The first one's my favorite, but I understand why people love Evil Dead 2, because Evil Dead 2 is the best combination of Evil Dead, and you combine Evil Dead and Army of Darkness, you get Evil Dead 2.
Oh, okay.
Evil Dead 2 is essentially a comedic spoof of Evil Dead 1, but what I almost want to save the Evil Dead talk for another show. But talking about Army of Darkness, I think it's a great melding of horror comedy.
Yeah, well, and again, to me, it's kind of like it's really like more of an adventure film that has comedic things going on and horrific things going on. But I kind of take it seriously, at least to some degree, to the degree that I take Back to the Future seriously or something.
Okay.
Yeah. And I just remember being thoroughly entertained by it. like, and really impressed by all the stop motion fighting sequences. Like,
Yeah.
oh man.
Well, it has
great style.
It has a bigger budget than Evil Dead 2, but people like James Cameron were impressed with Evil Dead 2. And that's James Cameron like coming off of Aliens.
Yeah.
But he saw like how low budget Evil Dead 2 and was just kind of being like, oh shit, like, yeah, Sam Raimi is a guy to look out for, basically. Because I think Evil Dead 2 was made for like $1.5 million.
Wow.
And then the original Evil Dead was made for like, I don't know, 300,000.
Well, that was
something.
my impression, was like those first two are quite low budget, but then Army of Darkness was a pretty legitimate picture. Like,
well, you definitely see the leap from Evil Dead 1 to Evil Dead 2. Even there, you see quite a leap.
yeah, okay. And then into Army of Darkness, it's even more.
It's even more so. Yeah. I think
Yeah,
by Army of
it
Darkness,
feels like a pretty legit movie.
I think it's like 10
not
million. Like 10 million for the early 90s
Yeah.
isn't too bad. Yeah, the nice thing about the second one is it's still got a lot of comedy, but it's also, the horror is more horrific. Like if you were a very squeamish person who got scared easily, you'd probably think of Evil Dead 2 as a legitimate horror movie. But yeah, I just think Army of Darkness is like, yeah, it's got that, it's tonally, it's great. It's kind of a throwback to the old Ray Harryhausen movies of the 50s and 60s, like the Jason and the Argonauts. Well, Jason and the Argonauts, especially with the skeleton soldiers, but also like the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad.
Yeah.
All of those old stop motion things. And, but there's also a lot of like Sam Raimi is a big fan of the Three Stooges, and there's a lot of slapsticky Three Stooges stunts in Army of Darkness also. And yeah, I just love, you kind of see the evolution of this character Ash in the movies, and by Army of Darkness, he's just a complete cartoon. He's just an asshole by Army of Darkness. And like in the first movie, he's like kind of more like a realistic, kind of more wimpy, mature character. And it's just funny how the character arc just turns into this complete douchebag. But that's part of the fun of Army of Darkness, is he's like this time traveling asshole who's kind of smarter than everybody, but just by circumstance. He didn't really earn this wisdom.
Yeah,
He's
right.
He's just from the future. Did you ever see the alternate ending of Army of Darkness? Because
No.
there's two endings. Yeah, there's the classic one. There's the theatrical ending that I'm assuming is the one you saw, where he kind of ends up back in the present day and he's back at the supermarket and he's like finishing the story and gets attacked. But there's another version where when he goes back into the future, he like miscalculates you actually see him like dropping this like liquid into his mouth that's supposed to kind of put him into a coma where he'll wake up in the present time.
Oh, okay.
But he like miscalculates the drops. He like takes an extra drop, which winds him like 100 years into the future, where it's like an apocalyptic future and no one's there. And he's just like, oh, I took too much. Yeah, that's not really considered like the canon ending, even though that's the original ending.
Oh, interesting.
I kind of most people prefer the supermarket one because it's just an extra fight sequence, you know.
Yeah,
and it's a happier ending too.
Well, I like it. I think it's satisfying, you know.
Yeah.
But I'll definitely have to watch the other two movies to get a bit more context for the overall arc of those. Did you ever see the original Buffy the Vampire Slayer movie? No. And so was that preceding or proceeding the show?
That was before the show.
So they did the movie and then they did the show. Same cast or like
no,
who's in the
nobody. No, like actually, I think Seth Green had a deleted scene in the original movie.
Oh, okay.
So he would be the only reoccurring, but it's not even the same character. But he's the only actor that you could maybe argue is in both versions. Yeah, no, they're both. It's funny because they're both written by Joss Whedon, who later became famous for his work with Marvel and everything. Yeah. But it's just funny because the TV show and the movie like couldn't be more different. Even just the character of Buffy, who's almost the only same character, but it's in the movie she's like a valley girl cheerleader. And then in the TV show, she's almost more of this kind of outcast, kind of sort of unpopular, but more like intelligent, badass character. I don't know. Maybe the TV show is maybe closer to what Joss Whedon had in the books, because I think it was originally like a book series. The show is also like more kind of serious. Like there's comedic moments, like any show, but it's kind of taken seriously, while the movie is a full-blown vampire comedy.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha. Yeah, I mean, like, my impression is the show is fairly a fair bit of dramatic series. But again, I haven't really watched too much of it either.
I don't even know if I want to recommend it, because honestly, it's nostalgic for me, but it's a real movie of its time. Like, it has not.
For the movie, you mean?
The movie has, the show is the opposite. I think the show is actually really great and like held up well.
Yeah, a lot of people say good things about it.
Yeah,
It's
I
very
thought
beloved
it was kind of ahead
show.
of its time. It had great makeup, but the movie is just sort of. Yeah, it's very 90s. I'll just put it that way. Like, it's I don't know what you would think watching it as the first time. You just kind of, you'd probably watch it and be like, oh, it's not bad, but you're just sort of be like, oh, those were kind of weird choices to make. But maybe if they had made more sequels to the movie, maybe it could have grown into more of a franchise of its own.
Yeah.
But maybe just compared to the TV show, it does seem a fair bit inferior. But it starred Christy Swanson, who I remember I had a big crush on back in the day. And I mean, I remember the times when there wasn't a Buffy TV show and all we had was the movie.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what it was. But and it's not particularly funny. Like, for a horror comedy, like, it doesn't really even.
The movie isn't.
I never really found it. There's the occasional chuckle, but it's almost more like you're just not watching a serious movie than it being like just laugh out loud funny. Yeah.
Well, that's often kind of the way that I think some of these horror comedies are, right? Is they're, leading into dark humor, and they're kind of things that'll make you like chuckle or smirk a little bit at, they're being clever or cheeky or a little bit edgy or whatever.
Yeah.
As opposed to, say, like, hysterically funny. I mean, that's where Young Frankenstein, it actually really succeeds at being kind of this spooky movie, but also being quite hysterically funny, where you do laugh out loud.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why it's like the blueprint comedy horror film,
Mm-hmm. I think at that time, when Young Frankenstein came out, which was like 1974, there wasn't like a ton of spoof movies I could think of where they were kind of like, we're really focusing on a particular movie or franchise to spoof.
Yeah.
Like in the 60s, there was kind of some sort of spy spoof movies that sort of took the piss out of James Bond, but they weren't like James Bond spoof films. Like, not even Casino Royale was the 60s Casino Royale, which was like a James Bond spoof film. Even that didn't really spoof the James Bond movies as much as it kind of was spoofing the character. And so it didn't really seem until like Young Frankenstein where it was kind of like, no, like we're literally like recreating a kind of a famous iconic movie and just putting it on its head. So, and then, after that, Mel Brooks started doing that with other movies too. I mean, I guess Blazing Saddles was kind of that for the Western genre. I don't know if you're aware, Mel Brooks actually made a spoof movie that spoofs Alfred Hitchcock films. And a lot of people don't, it's kind of,
what's it called?
It's called High Anxiety. And it's kind of like one of the forgotten Mel Brooks movies. Like, a lot of people just, it never gets kind of lumped in with Spaceballs, or even Dracula Dead Loving It, I'd say, is more well known than High Anxiety. And maybe the problem is that, you have to watch, you don't have to watch like all the Hitchcock movies, but you'd have to watch like the really familiar with the really iconic, famous ones, right? Like Rear Window, The Birds, Psycho, Vertigo. If you kind of North by Northwest,
I've watched all those.
Yeah. But it's not bad. Like, it's actually pretty. When you are aware of what they're parodying, it's actually got some pretty clever stuff in it.
Yeah.
So High Anxiety.
That might be worth checking out sometime.
Yeah. No, I think it's definitely, it's worth a watch. Yeah. Actually, Cloris Leachman returns. Frau Brooker. Do you remember Frau Brooker? She's the, how would you describe her? She's one of the main characters in Young Frankenstein, but she's kind of like the woman who's been looking after the castle when they all show up. She's the one where every time she says her name, the horses jump.
Oh, yeah, fuck. Okay, that's bringing back some memories.
Yeah, she's very much not like that character in real life, but she's great. Like, she's in tons of... She's been around forever, and she plays an even more... like unflattering character and high anxiety. She's basically Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but they made her like, they give her like almost like a mustache. They make her look really, she can be really attractive when she's done up, but like kudos to her. She's very open to making herself look hideous for the sake of comedies.
Well, I think that's actually a thing that comedic actresses enjoy, you know, is doing crazy costumes and, you know, not being like beautiful or flattering.
Especially if you're a real actress, right? Just like, why would you not want to do that? That's what acting is really all about. If you want to just be pretty everything, then go be a model.
Right.
Don't call yourself an actress.
Well, that's just it. Like, there's lots of actresses who like to transform themselves.
Yeah. Helena Bonham Carter, you know.
What was that like? Yeah, there was that actress. They did like those Nanny McPhee movies.
Oh,
I don't know who the actress is who was in there, but
Emma Thompson.
Oh, it was Emma Thompson.
Yeah,
and
she's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, she just like turns herself into this hideous.
Tilda Swinton is another good example. Tilda Swinton plays all sorts of roles.
Oh, okay.
Like she'll be an old lady makeup. She'll even play like androgynous kind of roles. Like you know, she's kind of like any of these actresses that want like become like kind of chameleons, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of any other off the top. It's hard to find ones that like continuously do it though. A lot of actresses will be like, oh, I'll do the one movie where I'm ugly,
right,
to maybe get the respect and the Oscar, and then like they never really go back to it, you know?
Yeah, like there was some Charlize Theron doing
Monster.
Yep.
Or like Cameron Diaz in Being John Malkovich. And it's just sort of like, okay, yeah, that's a start, but you know, do more ugly stuff.
Yeah, well, maybe they don't get that many opportunities, you know? I don't, because on one hand, you think as well, it's like, how unfair is it that a beautiful actress then is also sucking up the roles for ugly women? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's like, you feel like, come on. The ugly actresses are sitting there going like, leave us something to do.
That's going to be like the next big like petition where it's like, you know, you have to play your own race and you have to play your own beauty.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, no, it's well, you know what? I always thought Meryl, you know, I think we brought up Meryl Streep in one of our other shows, and she's in that like kind of we kind of settled on the fact that she's kind of average looking, which is why maybe that's kind of why she became kind of like the actress of her generation, because she can so easily tilt towards kind of playing these sort of homely characters. But you could also, if you did her up properly, she'd actually also look quite attractive. And it's funny, this is now bringing up another movie that's, I think, perfect for this show that I didn't even think of, but it's a Meryl Streep movie. Did you ever see Death Becomes Her?
No.
Oh man, it's fucking great. It's a Robert Zemeckis movie.
Damn.
And it's got Bruce Willis in a very uncharacteristic Bruce, like it's basically Bruce Willis playing like a schlub, and it's Goldie Hawn and it's Meryl Streep, and the whole movie is about kind of beauty and narcissism and death, and it's one of those like movies where you're watching it for the good little bit and you're like, oh, is this just like a comedy? Like it takes a little while for the movie to become morbid, but once it does go there, it just doesn't stop. And I don't know why it's becoming more of a cult hit. I think as the years are going by, it's becoming more well known, but it's still, compared to his other movies, right? Like, and to be fair, Robert Zemeckis has a lot of classic movies like Back to the Future, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Forrest Gump. So this one kind of gets lost in the shadows of those movies. But dude, you would love this movie. It's even got really impressive early CGI. And
when did it come out?
Like,
that was
91,
90s, right?
91 or 92.
Okay.
Yeah. And Meryl Streep is, again, like I haven't actually seen as many Meryl Streep movies as I would have thought, but I gotta hand it to her. She is just as good as comedies as she is in dramas. Like, she's hilarious in the movie. Yeah. And so is Goldie Hawn. And Bruce Willis is great as a schlub. Like, he's just this like loser, but it was in a time in his career where he was playing just like, this was like made in between like Die Hard films. So it must have been like really funny, like just seeing this like, you know, like just this like balding Bruce Willis with a gut and a mustache, and he's just kind of being bitched around by these dominant women in the movie. But I mean, I don't know, I watched it as a kid, but you watching it now, like you'll be able to appreciate the movie on every level that again, as a kid, you lose a lot of the adult humor in it.
Right. Okay.
Even just humor about aging, right? And just being a narcissist who's just, it's all about kind of wanting to like preserve your youth and trying to be young.
Okay.
And then it just kind of goes into this, supernatural kind of element, but it's a great one. It's almost, actually, I'd almost say it's almost like a good date movie. Like if you want to like get a girl to watch a horror comedy with you, because I almost feel like women can relate to this movie more than guys, because it's that whole thing about preserving youth and taking that element into a horror kind of realm. So I think a lot of women find Death Becomes Her to be especially really funny. And as much as Bruce Willis is a big character, it is kind of like the two women that really own the movie. So yeah, no, Death Becomes Her.
I gotta check that out for sure.
It's really good. Yeah. But I don't know, man. You're my well is drying up, man.
Well,
I'm losing,
the last one that I had to talk
titles.
about is, taking us right back to Tim Burton. But this is a movie that I was quite surprised that I liked it as much as I did. But Dark Shadows. I really think Tim Burton's Dark Shadows is hilarious.
Yeah.
And again, that's probably, to compare it a little bit to Young Frankenstein, I think it's a movie that, again, I would say it's a lot more comedy than it is horror. It's not really, not, I don't think there's really anything in there that's scary, but it does lean a lot into the dark vibes and aesthetics and stuff. And
it's very, like campy might be a good word for Dark Shadows.
It's like deliberately campy, but also just a lot of hilarious stuff going on in that movie.
Well, the funny thing about Dark Shadows is like, are you familiar at all with the source material?
No, and I was going to ask you about this. Is like how, like, have you seen the series Dark Shadows?
No, because it's literally a soap opera that's got like hundreds of episodes.
Oh, okay.
And they're very low, but like it's, if you've ever seen any kind of soap operas from the 60s, like, God, they're shot on video, and it's like they're not even meant to be good, because they're like, fuck you, we're releasing like an episode a day or a week or however often they were doing it. So it was practically like watching a radio play. Like, it's just characters popping up and talking.
Yep.
The Barnabas character, who is Johnny Depp's vampire character, his character doesn't even, I think, show up until like maybe like season 2 or the end of season 1.
Okay.
So, you're just kind of watching this show, which is, I guess, their only real gimmick was that it was slightly supernatural. And I think when Barnabas showed up, he became the big hit of the show, and they kind of retooled the show kind of around Barnabas. But it just was, I don't know. I mean, I think you really, really had to have been a kid in the late 60s to have any kind of appreciation for that soap opera.
Maybe that's why, Tim Burton was inspired by that, because it's funny, like, to hear you talk about it the way that you do. It's like, what would even get a person into this thing in the first place? So
there was, after the soap opera, or kind of while the soap opera was being made, they actually made a Dark Shadows movie during the production of the show. And I actually think that, so it's called House of Dark Shadows. And I watched it. Like, that's my main experience with Dark Shadows, is that, and I think I also watched it because I think I was told that more than anything was sort of the inspiration for Tim Burton's Dark Shadows. It was almost like they wanted to parody the House of Dark Shadows movie, which from what I was told, it was almost like they kind of took the soap opera up to that point and just compressed it into like the most key moments, and being like, rather than watch the show, you can just watch this 90-minute movie. And I will say, like, I don't remember almost anything from this movie, but it was a lot easier to try to get through than even one episode of the show, because it at least looked like a movie. It was cinematic. It was nicely shot. And so I enjoyed it for that. And it had some nice atmosphere, but I remembered kind of being disappointed. I was like, I don't really have much to say about, like, I'm almost sort of surprised that Tim Burton did this. That he did Dark Shadows, because it's such an obscure kind of thing to
an obscure thing. but also, I mean, maybe maybe his main inspiration was he kind of saw what it could be.
Yeah.
And that was.
Well, I'm glad he did. Like, I'm. It's better that he did that. It's better to do an obscure update than Charlie and the Chocolate Factory,
Like something that's
or
really
Alice in
beloved or whatever.
Wonderland.
Yeah.
He should have been doing more. Like, there's
know.
so many things we could have. Like, he could have done an H.P. Lovecraft movie. He could have done Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah, and I mean, like there were certain things that were definitely up his alley. Like again, I think that him doing Sleepy Hollow and Sweeney Todd were both fantastic pieces of source material for him to work with.
Yeah.
But Dark Shadows, I think the whole concept. The main thing that I find funny about the concept is taking this historical Dracula guy and dropping him in the middle of a modern world that he has no understanding of. Yeah. And
a fish out of water, I guess, story, right?
Just putting him in that context it is so funny because you're watching Johnny Depp take everything very seriously, but he's just, totally a fish out of water.
Well, and I love the 70s. Like the fact that it didn't, they could have brought him into modern day, but they're like, we're going to bring him into 70s modern day.
Yeah.
And so
That's
it's like,
great.
they got the lava lamps, and then you're going to get the 70s soundtracks. So I'm really glad that they went there with it.
Yeah. The Alice Cooper cameo is probably like my favorite thing in the movie.
That. Yeah. I guess for me, I suppose we'll probably never get one, but it's just a shame that we'll never really get like a hard rated R. Maybe Sleepy Hollow is rated R, but like
I'm pretty sure it is.
Yeah, like that's Sleepy Hollow. I guess will probably end up being.
In fact, Sweeney Todd is too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it is a pretty gruesome movie.
I guess for the gore, eh? Because it wouldn't be for nudity or swearing, right? So it would have to be for the violence, I guess. Yeah. No, I just was thinking like it would be nice if like Tim Burton made a movie that was like truly like terrifying. Like not just a rated R movie, but a movie that was like the goal was to be like, this is a real horror movie. My goal is to do nothing more but to really freak you out. But I don't know. I don't know if that's
maybe that's just not
his,
really in his
skill set.
Yeah, I in many ways I don't think that it is. I think that his style is that he kind of brings this comedic edge to things, or a little bit of a lighthearted edge sometimes. Because even Sleepy Hollow, and I would maybe say Sleepy Hollow is like his most serious movie, kind of.
I would say it's probably his darkest. Yeah. Like,
yeah,
I mean,
I'm trying to think if there's, I mean,
like
actually,
Ed Wood is serious and yet it's not.
Yeah. Or like Big Fish is kind of serious in that it's like it's a drama film, really.
Yeah. Big Fish might be his most serious or mature, maybe would be the word.
Yeah.
Maybe his most deep. His deepest film.
Sure.
But
it's just even Sleepy Hollow, which is probably kind of his darkest, most scary approach to some sort of material. It's still got like this lightheartedness to certain aspects of it. You know?
He's still kind of. I feel like with Sleepy Hollow, he was still conscious that there would be younger people who are going to see the movie, and he didn't want to completely fuck them up with something traumatizing. Yeah. I guess the only reason why I wonder why he's never done a real horror movie is because I have to assume that he must be a fan of true horror movies himself. Like he must enjoy being scared and being a fan of real horror movies, unless he's not.
Well, I know he was at least a big fan of like kind of the classic horror movies.
Yeah. Maybe he's just.
I don't know. I am curious how he feels about like modern horror, and
he might be kind of trapped in his childhood, right? Where it's like that's the sort of feel he wants, and then when they started becoming more extreme, he's like, oh well, that's when I was an adult, and he doesn't maybe relate to like the sort of 70s 80s horror. That
there's a lot of people like that who kind of get a little bit hung up on the material they grew up with, and then that's sort of like this cutoff point for them, and then they just take all their inspiration from that.
That's kind of me in many ways. Like that's kind of me with like the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then kind of when the 2000s kind of comes around, I'm kind of like, there's a little bit of magic that's gone for me. From there. So I get it.
I still find things to get inspired by these days, but it depends.
Oh, there's definitely stuff, but it's not like it's not at the massive quantities of like even the kind of the bad stuff of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I'm kind of still kind of like, oh, there's something there that I like. maybe not the bad ones, but more like the kind of there's like a lot of average mediocre ones that I'm kind of like, oh, but it's at least average in that 80s sense, as opposed to a bad horror movie made in like the 2010s. I'm just sort of like, I can't even watch it.
It's like, because at least the other one still has the 80s charm, you know?
It got tough when movies started looking like the movies that I was making for fun. Maybe they had slightly higher budgets, but I was just sort of like, yeah, this doesn't seem like a movie. This kind of seems like somebody that just like a group of people kind of just like threw together with, I don't know. Yeah, I think like, the digital aspect had a big part to do with it. Because again, horror is always known for being low budgets. So I think the one genre that faster moved to digital than any other one was horror. You know, you were seeing it in the found footage movies, and then even just after a certain point, you're just like, oh yeah, horror movies are just shot on digital now. And I mean, at this point, I guess everything is. But because horror is so focused on atmosphere and the look, it kind of falls apart when it's kind of shot with a bad camera or with a bad technique. It's like, oh, well, there goes all that atmosphere, which is every reason that I'm watching these movies. Yeah. Like I don't like how like a lot of horror movies, like it's like I have to wait to find out if I'm watching a horror movie, if I'm watching just a porno movie, because the style and technique is almost indecipherable with some of these low budget films. And I mean, maybe that's a kudos to even old porno movies were fairly cinematic, where you could almost be like, oh, some of these old porno movies could almost look like legitimate movies until the sex scene pops in.
They've got better stories and better writing than,
and everyone's kind of made up, like they got the hair and makeup done, like actresses back then. And you're like, this is almost a real movie.
Yeah. This porn is of high quality. It's got an excellent plot.
Well, I think P.T. Anderson talks about that a lot, like, because of making Boogie Nights. He saw like the real art form in old porn. Yeah. And then just felt it became schlock later on with like video. But there's something to be said about that. There is actually a class in, like when you watch some of these old 70s movies, it's like if it was shot on film, it looks like a film regardless of what it actually is, you know? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I could technically go off on more movie titles, but the ones that I really wanted to talk about, I feel I've said. I don't know how long our show is, but it might be good to. Yeah,
we've hit the major ones here. I think I've talked about pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about.
Do you know how we're doing for time right now on this show?
We're at an hour and 50 minutes. So okay. I mean, if we can keep this under 2 hours, wow, that would be a new record for us.
Yeah.
But at least we don't have to. I mean, we don't have to cram anything else in here.
Yeah, no, I mean...
it's been a good little conversation and exploration of, again, spanning multiple decades.
So I don't know how easily you'll be able to remember all these titles I threw at you tonight, but are there any... you kind of mentioned them earlier, but yeah, with after the end of this, are there any major titles that kind of popped out at you that I talked about that you're particularly like, oh, okay, those are the ones maybe I'll...
Well, the Evil Dead movies.
Yeah.
The Death Becomes Her probably seems like one that I should definitely watch. And I do want to watch that Dracula.
Dead and Loving It.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be a lot of fun. Yeah. Well, I would recommend just, I'm actually not crazy about the Bela Lugosi Dracula movie. That might be something for another podcast. I guess I wasn't sure if we were ever going to have a vampire one, but I actually find Dracula to be kind of one of the most overrated of the original Universal films. It's partly due to, it was probably like the first sound horror movie for Universal, and it shows. Like, it's just, they were basically like, oh wow, we're recording the dialogue, but let's have no music in this fucker. and it's an adaptation of the stage play of Dracula. So you watch it and you're like, yeah, this is a stage play. This isn't really a movie. It's just, it took me a long time to kind of recognize why the movie just didn't work for me the way some of the other ones did.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
But you got to watch it now, because if you're going to do Dracula, Dracula Dead and Loving It.
Yeah. No, to be honest, I'd love to at least have the reference of it too anyway, right? It's like...
Luckily, it's like barely an hour long. Like some of those old movies are fairly short. Like a lot of them are just under 70 minutes. So, it won't be that painful. And there is some nice atmospheric stuff in Dracula for sure. There's no question about it.
There's a part of me that likes watching this stuff just as like a glimpse into history, Yeah. Like, for instance, so I started watching what was I watching earlier today? It was something that we'd referenced.
Two Girls, One Cup?
No. I realized that it was like over 100 years old. Was it The Mascot?
Nosferatu?
No. I think because we were talking about it just the other day. I guess maybe it was The Mascot. That's actually from 1933.
Well, that'd be 90 years old.
Yeah, 90 years. Okay. But even still, just looking back at it and being like, this is like a 90-year-old thing. And that's one of the things that fascinates me about looking at old films is it's just a glimpse into that time period.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, just seeing it captured. And even though it's like staged and whatnot, you're still seeing real people and sort of their imagination on display. You know, it's like these are the sorts of things that a person felt compelled to produce and communicate through this newish art form that was coming along. You know, films and the cinematic art form.
I always used to be a little bit resistant to watching old movies. Like, not, I mean, compared to most people, like I grew up on old movies, so I was probably less resistant than most people. But even like now, it's like if I'm going to watch like a movie from the 30s I haven't seen, there's always a part of me just being like, oh, is this going to be a real slag to get through?
Right.
But most of the time, because I am trying to watch the good classic ones, once I actually start getting into them, I do start getting impressed, not because it's blowing my mind, but it's just in the fact that it is doing technical things that I'm not expecting it to do and being like, wow, this is actually really impressive considering the time it was made in, and I can actually start appreciating and respecting it for that, which is how I felt about The Mascot. Like, I actually find The Mascot to be 1,000,000 times more impressive than Dracula.
Yeah, well, it's amazing to watch them doing that stop motion like that early on, you know?
Yeah. It's
and to see like how, I don't know, like it's not like primitive stop motion either.
No, it's like very advanced, to be honest. Like there's stuff in it that I think is like literally like Nightmare Before Christmas level. It's just that it's black and white.
Yeah,
so,
exactly. Seeing like that dog and some of the animation and like in his face and his expressions and I don't know. There was like the cool thing where the devil pops out and then he's
out of the booze bottle.
Yeah. And then he's like summoning all these like little, there's like the paper, the torn up paper flying, and it blows into his legs, but then it like turns into these like figures that go walking along, and then you have like the little straw figures that like blow over to his feet, and then they turn into these figures. And I was just like, wow, that's like really cool to see that happen. Cool and impressive.
But from what I know is he essentially made most of these animations like completely on his own.
Wow.
He was like a one-man crew.
Oh,
but he just understood how stop motion and photography worked. So he would just build it and shoot it, and he didn't really need anybody else. So it's like I love watching stuff where a person has complete creative control. Like they're on a tour and you're truly like just seeing them expressing themselves without all these other people putting their their fingers in the pie.
Yeah.
But anyways, it's The Mascot, again, for people listening, that was a show we kind of covered more in the animated episode, but I'm glad you brought it up again because I think it's worth, especially if you like animations and spooky stuff. I just discovered the movie just like a year or so ago, and I was just sort of like, where the hell did this come from?
Yeah, I'd never heard of it before.
Yeah.
But it was cool to see, and now I have a bit of a reference for it. But again, that's one of the reasons why I like watching some of this old stuff, and maybe I'll do that with Dracula too. Like, it's good to just have a reference of what it is and what it's about.
Like the main thing I feel that you get from the original Dracula that you'll appreciate with Dracula Dead and Loving It is the Renfield character.
Oh, okay.
Is fully a parody of the original Renfield from the Bela Lugosi Dracula.
Okay, gotcha.
So there's little things like that.
Well, and there's been a variety of different portrayals of that, right? Like, for instance, Nosferatu, I was watching the Peter
Werner
Herzog's version. Yeah. And so there's like a Renfield character in that movie.
Yeah. And
you got like the original, you've got that version, you've got the parody version.
You got Tom Waits.
Yeah. Whole bunch of them, right?
Yeah. So. But it's funny too, because I think the original, to me, like the Renfield in the original movie, he's like one of the great highlights of the original one. Like he's a real standout character. So I actually am really happy that they chose that Renfield to parody for Dracula Dead and Loving It. And yeah, some of it's just, I remember when we were talking about Bram Stoker's Dracula, you were kind of saying about how it's kind of a bit hard to follow the storyline or the plot points a bit. And
or you just forget about it.
It gets easier when you watch more Dracula movies. You start to really connect the common elements in each one, and after a certain point, you're kind of like, oh, okay, here's the basic gist that seems to be in all of the movies, and it's it's like Jonathan or Renfield goes to Transylvania. They always kind of like. They're kind of interchangeable there, because I think in the book, kind of both I think in the book, Renfield had gone to see Dracula, so in the book it's usually Jonathan who goes, but sometimes they just make it Renfield, and then eventually Dracula goes to England, and so there's like little kind of like main like key moments, and then like it's like the little small details is where they change it up. But when you watch enough Dracula movies, you're kind of like, oh, okay, this is the common thing in almost all the movies. But yeah, no, I think you'll have a lot of maybe down the road we'll do like a sort of another episode where we'll get your thoughts on a bunch of these movies that you'll end up seeing.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and that's just it. Halloween comes around every year, so we'll probably end up diving into more stuff next year and whatever. Yeah, we might even. If we run out of material, we might jump into horror stuff before we get to next Halloween.
Well,
that's just it. Yeah, I mean, it might be a suitable time. Who knows where we'll go with all these podcast episodes? Just we'll go wherever the wind blows us. But yeah, in any case, this has been a fun little topic to cover, and hopefully our listeners have discovered some things, got some ideas of things they'd like to check out. Thank you for joining us on our conversation.
I guess we'll just wait until you guys tune in to the next episode where we'll be covering torture porn. No, we don't know what we're gonna do next.
We don't know what we're doing next.
But by the time you hear this episode, it might already be aware of what the next episode will be. But I guess you'll tune in to find out.
Yes, indeed.
I'm Oliver Drawson.
And I'm Kevin Rosmer. Have a good night.